Did you ever stop and ask yourself, why is it that some people are more successful than others? Why is it that some people make more money, live longer, have better relationships, while the great mass of men, as Thoreau said, live lives of quiet desperation? When I was 15, I set out on a lifelong journey to find the answer to that question. Why are some people more successful than others? You see, when I was growing up, my family never seemed to have enough money. My parents grew up during the Depression, and I heard the same things over and over again throughout my childhood. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. I don't know if you heard that when you were growing up. It seemed to be the national anthem. I was not a great student. I passed out of high school when I was 18. I say passed out because, rather than graduated, because that's what happened. I passed out in the half of the class that made the top half possible. Here in the same half. The person in front of me on the stage and the person in back of me received diplomas, and I got a leaving certificate. When you open it up, it says goodbye. Anyway, since then, I've traveled and worked in more than 80 countries on 6 continents. I've sailed on all the great oceans. I've been around the world 2 or 3 times. I became fluent in French, German, and Spanish, as well as learning to get along in several other languages. When you need to eat, you learn. Anyway, I started off as poor as I could be, searching for the secrets of success. And over the years, I've read and studied for over 30,000 hours in business, economics, psychology, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, and history to find the secrets of success. And I'm happy to say that I eventually found the answers I was looking for. Today, I live in a $1 million house on a golf course in Southern California, and I have business interests in 9 countries. Today, I know and I've proven that success in any field, including this field, is as predictable as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And my purpose in speaking with you today is to share with you some of the most important things I've ever learned. However, as Aristotle once said, you can't teach a person something that they don't already know. You're already high achievers and great successes in your careers. You're already the cream of your profession. So many of you already know what we're going to talk about, and the rest of you will recognize these principles as soon as you hear them. About 5 years ago, I met a wise and wealthy man who had spent his entire life studying success. And he'd reached a clear conclusion concerning the reason for success in life and especially in business. He's dead now, but I'll never forget what he told me, because I immediately recognized that he put the finger on my reason for success and yours, as we'll talk about in a minute. He said the key to success was to set a goal and then to stay with it until you achieve success in at least one important thing. He said that your subconscious mind will then accept that success experience and store it as a pattern, like a template. And then from then on, your subconscious will drive you and direct you and guide you to repeat the pattern of success in other things that you attempt. Another way of saying it is that nothing succeeds like success. Psychologists have demonstrated that achievement brings you a natural high. Once you've experienced your first great success, then not only are you unconsciously programmed to repeat it, but nothing else will ever give you the same wonderful sense of satisfaction. All high achievers know that. Anyway, I learned the truth of this idea many years ago when I first started travel. I spent 8 years traveling around the world. And in many ways, a trip or a journey is a metaphor for life. My first big trip was that, and much, much more. It had such an enormous impact on me that I've never really gotten over it. My whole life has been different as a result of what I call the Sahara crossing. Let me tell you about it. When I was 18, 3 friends and I decided we'd go off and see the world. We were well out of high school, and we were laboring in sawmills on the West Coast. This is in 1963, and a lot of our friends were heading for Europe to travel around with backpacks. So we decided to do something different. Nobody else was going to Africa, so we decided we'd go to Africa. Of course, it never occurred to us to ask why it was that no one else was going to Africa. And that was our first mistake. After working and saving for a year, the 4 of us piled into an old 1946 Chevy and drove out of Vancouver, bound for Montreal, via Toronto. Actually, we just passed a couple of blocks from here on our way on that trip. It was late at night when we left. It was pouring rain. We were all 20 years old, and we were off to see the world. Anyway, I learned later that almost every great venture begins with an act of faith, like driving into the dark, into the unknown. In a way, nature protects us by shielding us from knowledge of the difficulties and obstacles that lie ahead. Because if we really knew all the problems we would face, the setbacks, the suffering, the temporary failure, and the disappointments, many of us would hesitate about ever even starting out at all. And our plan was to drive across country to Montreal, get jobs on ships to work our way across the Atlantic, and then head south across Europe to Africa. Pretty basic plan. However, as it happened in Montreal, one of the guys decided to give up and go home, and so he left us. Well, that left 3. The other 2, after one day, still remember that, after one day of looking for work on the waterfront, decided to quit. Decided to quit trying and to spend their limited savings to pay their way across the Atlantic, rather than to work their way. I tried to talk them out of it. I told them that quitting is a habit. If you quit the first time you run into difficulties, you'll always quit when the going gets rough. You will, in effect, establish a pattern for failure rather than a pattern for success. But their minds were made up. So we split our savings and they took passage on a ship to England. I worked on a construction site in Montreal, hauling heavy things for the entire winter. And then I got a job on a Norwegian freighter out of Halifax in late February and arrived in England mid-April. As I had predicted, my friends had quit and stayed in England working at odd jobs. However, we soon made up, good buddies again. Once more, we headed for Africa. At this time, all we had was an 8.5 by 11-inch page about this size that had Europe and Africa all on the same map, on the same page. And it seemed to be a very simple thing to go from we were young and we hadn't learned that it's the details that get you every single time. So we took a train down to London. There we bought bicycles. See, we never heard of anyone riding from London to Johannesburg on bicycles, so we decided that we would do it first and become famous. That was another mistake. We soon learned that when you ride bicycles across France in the springtime, you find that the hills are all uphill and the wind is always in your face. So likewise, I found that when you embark on any new venture, you often find the same thing. Everything seems to go wrong, usually at the worst possible time and in the worst possible and most expensive way, like starting a new business or a new career. Anyway, after 2 weeks of grinding along on bicycles uphill the whole way, which seems like a geographical impossibility, but it's true, we said, the heck with this. We loaded the bikes on a train and we rode across France and Spain to Gibraltar. There we sold the bicycles and bought a Land Rover with our last dollar. We had definitely learned why no one had ever crossed Africa on bicycles. It was darn near impossible to cross France on bicycles. So now we had a little problem. We were out of money. We'd exhausted our meager finances buying the Land Rover, and we didn't have enough money for fuel and equipment. So we all sat down. We considered ourselves great writers at that time. We all sat down and wrote letters to everybody that we knew, pleading for money, telling them how desperate our situation was. Sitting here looking across the Straits of Gibraltar to Africa, all we needed was just a little bit of money to get us over there. Anyway, eventually we got a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, and then we got one big score. I'll never forget this. An uncle of Jeff's that he'd only seen once in his life sent us 100 pounds. 100 pounds at that time was $300, worth more than $1,000 today. And we were ecstatic. We were saved. So this is another lesson. Nobody ever makes it on their own. One of the great lessons of life. We all need help from others to get over the rough spots on the journey of life. Well, with the additional money, we loaded up with food and supplies. We took the ferry over to Tangiers and Morocco. And then we headed out of Tangiers toward the Atlas Mountains and the Sahara, full of excitement, singing as we drove down the road. And I learned a valuable lesson from this. I learned then and for the rest of your life, whenever you try to do something out of the ordinary, people will line up to tell you that you can't do it, why you can't do it, that you'll lose your time, you'll lose your money, that you will, in effect, die in the desert. Even people who should know better will try to discourage you. To achieve anything greater worthwhile, you must train yourself to rise above these people, ignoring them and pressing on towards your goal regardless. We crossed from Morocco into Algeria and drove south to the town of Adrar on the edge of the Sahara. But this time our vehicle was falling apart. And with the cost of repairs and gasoline and food, we'd almost run out of money again. One of the guys, sick from dysentery, decided to give up. He took his money and his belongings and he hitchhiked to the Mediterranean, 500 miles north and then back to England. That left two of us. We began wondering, what are we doing here? We were two young men, 20 and 21 years of age, thousands of miles from home, sick, tired, and almost broke, with thousands of miles ahead of us. We couldn't even remember why we started out in the first place, except that we had set it as a goal, and we were too dumb to change it. Anyway, but one of the things that kept us going was a book of poetry by Robert W. Service. Robert W. Service had driven an ambulance in World War I, and he'd written poetry to cheer up the soldiers in the trenches on the Western Front. And there was one poem that we read over and over. It always gave us a boost in the determination to go forward. It was called Carry On. And it started like this. It said, "It's easy to fight when everything's right, when you're mad with the thrill and the glory. It's easy to cheer when victory is near and wallow in fields that are gory. It's a different song when everything's wrong, when you're feeling infernally mortal, when it's 10 against 1 and hope there is none. Buck up, little soldier, and chortle. Carry on, carry on. There isn't much punch in your blow. You're glaring and staring and hitting out blinds. You're muddy and bloody, but never you mind. Carry on, carry on. You haven't the ghost of a show. It's looking like death, but while you've a breath, carry on, my son, carry on." Well, by this time we were in the Sahara, the largest desert on earth. It stretches across the Tropic of Capricorn from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, more than 5,000 miles. And the part that we faced, dead ahead, was the Tenezret, the emptiest single stretch of the Sahara, 500 miles of nothing. Not a fly, not a blade of grass, as flat as a tabletop. 500 miles. The enormity of what we had embarked on finally began to sink in. We learned that more than 1,300 people had perished in the Tenezret in the last 20 years. 42 vehicles had broken down in the desert, and many of their drivers were never seen again alive. By this time, Jeff and I were once more out of money. All our tires were scraped bald and they needed to be replaced. We needed additional tanks so we could carry enough gas and water for the crossing. We needed tools to do repairs. We needed a jack and lug wrench so that we could change tires. Obvious. For 3 weeks, we stayed in a drawer. Jeff hitchhiked north to Algiers to wire for more money, more creative writing. While I sold all our supplies except for a bare minimum. With that money and by stripping abandoned vehicles, I got the Land Rover repaired and properly outfitted with reasonably good tires, a reserve gas tank, proper tools, and supplies for the crossing. It's amazing how enterprising you become when your survival is at stake. Because of the heat, you can only travel before 10 a.m. and after 4 p.m. The midday sun is so hot that if you drive, your engine oil boils. It becomes as thin as water, and your vehicle seizes up and it'll never run again. 6 weeks after crossing from Gibraltar, we were ready. Jeff came back with some money from his parents, and the vehicle was in perfect condition for the crossing. We realized that if anything did go wrong and we couldn't fix it, we would most certainly die in the desert. Found that you can achieve almost any goal you set for yourself if you simply take it one oil barrel, one step at a time. If you go as far as you can see, you will then see far enough to go further. I'll wrap up this story here by telling you what I learned about life and success in the Sahara crossing. Here are 7 rules you can apply to any challenge that you face in achieving anything you desire. Rule number 1, the most important key to achieving great success is to decide upon your goal and then launch. Get started. Take action. Do something. Move. A 12-year study at Babson College concluded that the act of taking the first step is what separates the losers from the winners, or the winners from the losers. We set out at the age of 20 with $300 each to cross 3 continents and travel 17,000 miles from Vancouver to Johannesburg in southern Africa. And we made it in just under 12 months. But the most important step was the first one. All the rest followed from there. Number 2, once you've launched towards your goal, never consider the possibility of failure. Always forward, never backward. Never consider the possibility of failure. Every person here is here because they refused to quit when the going got rough. Your ability to persist in the face of setbacks and disappointments is vital to all great achievement, and it's always a decision that you make. It's not the external environment, it's always the internal environment. Number 3, the biggest goal in the world can be accomplished if you just take it one oil barrel at a time. Thomas Carlyle once wrote that our great business is not to see what lies dimly at a distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand. The only time you will ever have is now. If you live every day, every hour, the best you can, the rest will take care of itself. As the Bible says, sufficient unto the day are the cares thereof. Number 4, watch out for the naysayers. The negative people around you are always telling you that you'll die in the desert. Get around positive people. Get around winners like people in this room. Fly with the eagles and refuse to listen to objections and reasons why you can't succeed. Someone once said that if every possible objection must first be overcome, nothing will ever get done. And truer words were never spoken. Number 5, welcome obstacles and difficulties as valuable and inevitable steps on the ladder of success. Remember that difficulties come not to obstruct, but to instruct. Difficulties come not to obstruct, but to instruct. Our trip to Africa was one problem after another. We ran out of money over and over. We strained every muscle of our bodies trying to ride bicycles across France and Spain. Our Land Rover broke down again and again. We suffered from dysentery and heat stroke and exhaustion. But when it was time, we were ready for the Sahara crossing. In retrospect, we saw clearly that without the lessons that we had learned from our mistakes, we would have surely died in the desert. And when you look back on any achievement, you will find it was preceded by many difficulties and many lessons. They are the price that you pay for your success, and no success is possible without them. Number 6, be clear about your goal, but be flexible about the process of achieving it. Be willing to change, to try something new. Keep your mind open and fluid and flexible. Be willing to accept feedback from your environment and correct your course. This is a key quality of peak performers. They're not rigid, they're flexible. Remember, it's not what you have, but what you do with what you have that separates winners from losers. It's not what happens to you, but how you respond to what happens to you that counts. In the final analysis, your response to the adversity of life is the real measure of who you are and what you're made of. The Greek philosopher Epictetus once said that circumstances do not make the man or woman, they merely reveal him to himself. And you find out who you really are when you face adversity. And remember, number 7, the last rule is nobody does it alone. At every step on our journey across Africa, people helped us with advice and with food and with assistance and with money, but especially with warmth and with kindness and with generosity. When life is over, it will be the people that we lived and laughed and loved with that we remember more than anything else. So don't be afraid to ask for help from others. It's a mark of strength and courage and character. And don't be reluctant to give of yourself to others generously. It's the mark of caring and compassion and personal greatness.